Fellow citizens, I presume you all know who I am. I am humble Abraham Lincoln. I have been solicited by many friends to become a candidate for the legislature. My politics are short and sweet, like the old woman's dance. I am in favor of a national bank. I am in favor of the internal improvement system and a high protective tariff. These are my sentiments and political principles. If elected, I shall be thankful. If not, it will be all the same. That was my first political speech, and I began stumping for the state legislature. But just about then, Chief Black Hawk and his Indians went out on the warpath, so I joined the volunteers and marched off to war. I was terrified that I might have to shoot some poor Indian. Fortunately, the Indians felt the same way, so I didn't see any fighting. It was there I was elected captain of volunteers, a success which gave me more pleasure than any I've had since. After serving near 3 months in the Army, I returned home with a great enthusiasm for renewing my political campaign. I figured my illustrious military career would help me win. It didn't. I lost the election. To make matters worse, the store in which I had been working as sort of a clerk went out of business and left me without the means to keep my body and soul together. I thought of learning the blacksmith trade. I considered the study of law, but I didn't think I could succeed without a better education. My parents had come from undistinguished families and had migrated from Virginia to Kentucky. In my 8th year, we moved to Indiana. It was a wild region. By now, I was old enough for schooling, except there were no schools. We sometimes had school when a schoolmaster happened to drift into the neighborhood, but school was out when he drifted away. By the time I was 21 years of age and had moved to Illinois, I'd guess all my schooling didn't amount to more than a year. But I did manage to learn to read and write and cipher to the rule of 3, and I read every book I could lay my hands on. I was also ready to try my hand at something else besides farming. My old dad had tried to find a decent farm in 5 different places in Kentucky, Indiana, and Illinois. We had moved so many times, I was ready to settle down to one little town. You know, whenever we'd move, we'd load our furniture into the wagon. Then we'd tie up the chickens' legs with some string so they wouldn't run away. Then we'd put the chickens and the pigs into the wagon with the furniture, and we'd move off to our next farm. It got so we moved so many times that whenever the chickens would see us put the furniture in the wagon, they'd lay on their backs and cross their legs. Well, anyway, having had some experience as a store clerk, I thought I'd try my hand in a business of my own. I borrowed some money, went into partnership with William Berry, and we opened the Lincoln Berry store at New Salem. It wasn't long before that winked out too. What with Berry drinking up all the profits and me reading all the time, little wonder the store didn't fail. But one day, while I'd been tending that store, a man who was migrating to the west drove up in a wagon which contained his family and all of his household plunder. He asked me if I'd buy an old barrel for which he had no room in his wagon, and which contained nothing of special value. I didn't want it, but to oblige him, I bought it and paid him $50 for it. Emptying it out on the floor to see what it contained, I found at the bottom of the barrel a complete edition of Blackstone's commentaries. I began to read that famous law book, and the more I read, the more intensely interested I became. That book was the beginning of my law studies. Well, Jesse, you have a good case in technical law, And we can, without a doubt, win it for you. We can also set a whole neighborhood at loggerheads. We can distress a widowed mother and her 6 fatherless children. And we can get for you $600, which you seem to have a legal claim, but which rightfully belongs, it appears to me, as much to the woman and children as it does to you. Now you must remember that some things legally right are not always morally right. You'll have to get some other lawyer to win this case for you. I couldn't do it. All the while I'd be in front of that jury, I'd keep saying to myself, Abe Lincoln, you're a liar. I believe I'd forget myself and say it out loud. I will give you a little advice, though, for which I'll charge you nothing. Now, you seem to be a sprightly, energetic man. I'd advise you to try your hand at making $600 some other way. And now, good day, sir. There goes the biggest liar in Springfield. He reminds me of the old fisherman who had quite a reputation for stretching the truth. He got himself a set of scales, and he insisted on weighing each fish he caught before witnesses. One day a doctor borrowed his scales to weigh a newborn baby. The baby weighed 47 pounds. Yeah, they say I tell too many stories. Well, I reckon I do. But I have found that most people are more easily influenced through a broad and humorous illustration than in any other way. And what the hypercritical few may think, I don't care. I was sitting here the other day with my leg up on the desk, just like this. Billy Herndon walked in. He looked at my leg and he said, Abe, I don't think there's another leg in the whole of Sangamon County as long as that one there. And reaching down and lifting up my other leg to the desk, I said, Billy, my guess is you're wrong. I just happen to have another one that's a perfect match. No, I don't think there's anything gets more joshing than my long legs, unless it be my ugly face. Now, you take last week when I was out riding on the circuit. I was just outside of Postville, and I met this woman riding horseback through the woods. Well, as I stopped to let her pass, she also stopped, and I thought I'd pay her a little compliment, and I said, My, you sure do look pretty today. She said, Well, thank you. I'm sorry I can't say the same for you. I said, You could if you told a lie like I did. Well, she got all flustered like an old hen, and she looked at me and she said, I do believe you are the ugliest man I ever did see. Ugly. I said, Madam, you probably are right, but I can't help it. No, you can't help it, but you might try staying at home. When I got to my hotel, I got into a fit of musing in my room, and I sat there resting my elbows on the bureau. And staring into the looking-glass, it struck me what an ugly man I really was. It so maddened me that I resolved, should I ever see an uglier man than myself, I'd shoot the poor critter on sight. When I got home to Springfield, I ran into old Ben Bodenshame. Looking at him closely, I said to myself, Now there's the man. Look how ugly he is. I went home, took down my gun, and I prowled around the streets looking for him. He soon come along. Halt, Ben, said I, say your prayers. I'm about to shoot you. Mr. Lincoln, what's the matter? What have I done? Well, said I made an oath. Should I ever see an uglier man than myself, I'd shoot the poor critter on sight. Now, you're surely uglier, so make ready to die. Old Ben, he sort of backed off and he looked me square in the eye and he said, Abe, go ahead and shoot. If I'm an uglier man than you, I don't want to live. Here's what I heard over to Beardstown. Seems there was a runaway slave who made his way north by the Underground Railroad. Well, he was brought before an official of the Abolitionist Society who asked him, Why did you run away? Did your master beat you? No, sir. Master was kind. Did he starve you? No, sir. I had plenty to eat. Did you have to work too hard? No, sir. I didn't have to work too hard. I don't understand why you ran away from that plantation. Well, sir, I believe my job is still open if you want to go back and take it yourself. No, I never knew of any man who wished to be a slave himself. Whenever I hear of anyone arguing in favor of slavery, I feel a strong impulse to see it tried on him personally. When it comes to freedom, we're not what we have been. When we were the political slaves of King George and we wanted to be free, we called the maxim that all men are created equal a self-evident truth. But now that we've grown fat and have lost all dread of being slaves ourselves, we've become so greedy to be masters, we call the same maxim a self-evident lie. I've always hated slavery. I cannot remember when I didn't. Once I was on a steamboat on the Mississippi River, going from Quincy to Alton, and there was a gentleman on board with 12 Negroes. He was shipping them down to Vicksburg to the slave markets, and he had them chained together 6 and 6, each of them with a small iron band around his wrist. And this was chained to a long main chain, so that they were strung together precisely like so many fish on a trot line. I gathered they were being separated from their mothers, fathers, wives, children, whatever families the poor creatures had, to be whipped into perpetual slavery, and no questions asked. That's a sight that'll burn in my memory forever. How can anyone say slavery is not wrong? If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. No man is good enough to govern another man without that other's consent. As I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. This expresses my idea of a democracy. And whatever differs from this, to the extent of the difference, is no democracy. The repeal of the Missouri Compromise has aroused me no end. I lost interest in politics for the last few years, but I reckon I'm going to take another crack at it. Mr. Chairman, gentlemen of the convention, if we could first know where we are and whither we are tending, we could better judge what to do and how to do it. We are now far into the 5th year since a policy has been initiated with the avowed object and confident promise of putting an end to slavery agitation. Under the operation of that policy, that agitation has not only not ceased, but has constantly augmented. In my opinion, it will not cease until a crisis shall have been reached and passed. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently, half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall. But I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it and place it where the public mind shall rest in the belief that it is in the course of ultimate extinction, or its advocates will push it forward until it shall become alike lawful in all the states, old as well as new, north as well as south. July 31st, 1858. Honorable Stephen A. Douglas. Dear Sir, yours of yesterday, naming places, times, and terms for joint discussions between us, was received this morning. Although by the terms as you propose, you take 4 openings and closes to my 3, I accede, and thus close the arrangements. Your obedient servant, A. Lincoln. Fellow citizens, Stephen Douglas has the high distinction, so far as I know, of never having said slavery is either right or wrong. Everyone else says one thing or the other, but the judge never does. My friends, the Declaration of Independence was thought to include all. But now, to aid in making the bondage of the Negro universal and eternal, it is assailed and sneered at and construed and hawked at and torn until if its framers could rise from their graves, they could not at all recognize it. All the powers on earth are combining against the Negro. The god of money is after him. Ambition follows. Philosophy follows, and the theology of the day is fast joining the cry. Certainly the Negro is not our equal in color, perhaps not in many other respects. Still, in the right to put into his mouth the bread that his own hands have earned, he is my equal, the equal of Judge Douglas, and the equal of every living man, white or black. In pointing out that more has been given you, you cannot be justified in taking away the little that has been given him. All I ask for the Negro is if you do not like him, let him alone. If God gave him but little, that little let him enjoy. Fellow citizens, 22 years ago, Senator Douglas and I first became acquainted. We were both young then, he a trifle younger than I. Even then, we were both ambitious. I perhaps quite as much so as he. With me, the race of ambition has been a failure, a flat failure. But with him, it has been one of splendid success. His name fills the nation, and it is not unknown even in foreign lands. Now, Judge Douglas has told you that I have failed at everything I've ever attempted. Farming, storekeeping, liquor selling, and law. And he tells you I'm about to make the biggest failure of all, politics. One thing he forgot to mention to you. Now, he told you I sold whiskey over the counter. That's true. I worked for a while in a grocery over there at New Salem when I was a younger man, and I did sell whiskey. What he failed to mention was that while I sold whiskey over one side of the counter, he was always standing on the other side drinking it. The big difference between him and me now is I've quit my side of the counter. But let us discard all this quibbling about this man and the other man, this race and that race and the other race being inferior and therefore must be placed in an inferior position. Let us discard all these things and unite as one people throughout this land, until we shall once more stand up declaring that all men are created equal. Fellow citizens, Judge Douglas has accused me of being a two-faced man. I leave that up to you, my audience. If I had another face, would I wear this one? It is true that if there was a necessary conflict between the white man and the Negro, I'd be for the white man as much as Judge Douglas. But I say there is no necessary conflict. I say there is room enough for us all to be free. October 19th, 1860. Miss Grace Bedell, Westfield, New York. My dear little miss, Your very agreeable letter of the 15th is received. I regret the necessity of saying I have no daughter. I have 3 sons, one 17, one 9, and one 7 years of age. They, with their mother, constitute my whole family. As to my growing whiskers, having never worn any, do you not think people would call it a piece of silly affectation if I should begin it now? Your very sincere well-wisher, A. Lincoln.
2 years ago, during the debates that I had with Senator Stephen Douglas, I had asked him the question about the power of settlers to exclude slavery from the territories by their vote. His reply to that question helped re-elect him to the Senate at that time, as I feared it would. But it undoubtedly hurt his chances to become the president now. When I first heard that Douglas had beat me in the election for the Senate, well, I felt somewhat like the boy who stubbed his toe while running to meet his sweetheart. Said he was too big to cry and too badly hurt to laugh. But now I have won the presidency that Douglas wanted so badly. I'd call that victory out of my earlier defeat. All right, Mary, will you please stop hurrying me? My goodness, I think my wife's afraid I'm going to miss my own inauguration. Still 3 months off. Seems like everybody else is in a bigger hurry to get to Washington than me. I'm not looking forward to all that trouble. All right, Molly, I'll start packing the trunks right away. There's no sure cure for laziness in a man, but having a wife sure will hurry him along some. I'm going to leave you for a little bit. I'll be back shortly. I hope you'll all be here to see me off at the train station when I leave for Washington. So if I may use the words of my deceased uncle, who was known as the most polite gentleman in the world, he got this reputation for being polite one day when he was going down the Mississippi River in a steamboat. Well, the boat sank. And as he was thrashing about in the water and going down for the last time, he tipped his hat and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, please excuse me." My friends, no one not in my situation can appreciate my feelings of sadness at this parting. To this place and the kindness of these people, I owe everything. Here I have lived a quarter of a century and have passed from a young to an old man. Here my children have been born, and one is buried. I now leave, not knowing when or whether ever I'll return, with a task before me greater than that which fell upon General Washington. Without the assistance of that divine being, whoever attended him, I cannot succeed. But with that assistance, I cannot fail. Trusting in him who can go with me, and remain with you, and be everywhere for good, let us confidently hope that all will yet be well. To his care commending you, as I hope in your prayers you will commend me, I bid you an affectionate farewell. Well, I've always wondered what it would be like to be the President of the United States. Now that I am, I feel like the feller that was tarred and feathered and run out of town on a rail. When someone in the crowd asked him how he liked it, he said, "Well, if it weren't for the honor of the thing, I'd much rather walk." I have been selected to fill an important office for a brief period, and am now invested with an influence which will soon pass away. But should my administration prove to be a very wicked one, or what is more probable, a very foolish one. If you, the people, are but true to yourselves and to the Constitution, there is but little harm that I can do. Thank God. In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without yourselves being the aggressor. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it. Seems like everybody in the country wants to work for the government nowadays. At least everybody in the city of Washington's lined up outside of the White House with applications for office. Slip in through half-open doors, edge their way through the crowds, and thrust these papers into my hands. Dog my every step. If they'd leave me alone, I could get work done. I'm like the hotel keeper who was so busy renting out rooms at one end of the hotel he didn't have time to put the fire out at the other end. I must tell you a little story I heard once about office seekers. Seems there was a certain king who kept an astrologer to forewarn him on coming events, see into the future. And well, one day while he was going to the woods with his hunting party, he met a farmer riding on a donkey. "Good morning, farmer," said the king. "Oh, good morning, king," said the farmer. "Where are you folks going today?" "Hunting," said the king. "Oh, but your majesty, you're going to get soaking wet if you go hunting today." Well, the king trusted his astrologer's advice, of course, and he kept on to the woods. But by midday there came a terrific storm that drenched and soaked everybody. When the king returned to the palace, he had the astrologer beheaded, and he sent for the farmer to take his place. "Oh, shucks," said the farmer, "'tain't me that knows when it's going to rain. It's my donkey. Whenever it's going to rain, he just lets his ears hang down." "Make the donkey the court astrologer," shouted the king. And it was done. But the king always declared that that appointment was the worst mistake he'd ever made in his life. Because after that, every jackass in the country assembled in front of the palace and wanted an office too. And there's no bigger jackass than Congressman Jeremiah Smith. Now, he's everywhere. Every time I turn a corner, there's Congressman Smith with an application for office. I go out for a walk, he's waiting on the sidewalk. Look out into the waiting room. Who's first in line? Congressman Smith. I can't go anywhere without expecting Smith to pop out of someplace with an application. Oh, it was touching how concerned he was the last time he caught a hold of me. "Mr. President, I'm afraid I'm imposing on you." Afraid? If he was so afraid, why didn't he run away? It isn't office seekers and congressmen, it's committees. One committee after another waiting to see the president about trivial little things. Well, like the committee of ministers that wanted to know whether the president seeks counsel in the Lord. Of course I seek counsel in the Lord. I pray every night before I retire. I think of the hundreds of thousands of soldiers fighting in this terrible war, the boys in gray as well as the boys in blue. I think of the thousands of weeping women and fatherless children, and I pray that God give them strength to bear their bereavements. I think of my responsibilities as President of the United States, and I pray for strength and wisdom. And then I look under the bed, and if I find that Congressman Smith is not there with an application for office, I thank the Lord, turn out the light, and I go to sleep. Some of our Northerners seem bewildered and dazzled by the excitement of the war. Some seem to think the only thing at stake is the preservation of the Union, while others are inclined to believe that this war is to result in the entire abolition of slavery. For my own part, I consider this struggle is for the necessity of proving that popular government is not an absurdity. We must settle this question now, whether in a free government the minority have a right to break up the government whenever they choose. If we fail, it will go far to prove the incapability of the people to govern themselves. Taking the government as we found it, we will see if the majority can preserve it. Mr. Nicolay, send a dispatch to General McClellan. Major General George B. McClellan. I have just read your dispatch on sore-tongued and fatigued horses. Will you pardon me for asking what the horses of your army have done since the Battle of Antietam that fatigues anything? A. Lincoln. McClellan sure has a bad case of the slows. He's an efficient organizer, but all the while he's preparing for war, he's losing the battle. If he doesn't intend to use his army, I'd sure like to borrow it for a day or two. Ladies and gentlemen, 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men living and dead who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause, for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. It's strange that I should be sitting here. I, a man who couldn't so much as cut a chicken's head off, sitting here with blood running all around me in this terrible war. I've had more questions of life and death to settle than all of the men who sat in this chair put together. A soldier's mother has just been to see me, begging for his pardon. He's just a farm boy. Here he is being executed for falling asleep at his post. The boy's action lost nothing for us. Yet, if I give out pardons, my generals say I destroyed discipline in the army. There are too many weeping mothers in this country. For God's sake, why do they ask me to add to that number? I'm not going to add to that number. Perhaps I'm doing wrong, but at least I'll make that poor woman happy. Here's a petition for the release of a slave trader from prison, for the reason that he is a religious man. Well, I'm glad to hear that.
Feller needs all the religion he can get. If this man were guilty of the foulest murder, I might forgive him on such an appeal. They know my weakness for appeals. But a man who could go to Africa, rob her of her children, and sell them into interminable bondage for no other reason than dollars and cents, he's worse than a murderer. He'll rot in jail before he'll have freedom by any act of mine. Religious man. He's like the feller that killed his mother and father for all their money. Then when he was tried for the crime, he appealed to the court for mercy on the grounds that he was an orphan. They want me to relieve General Grant from his command. They say he is incompetent, a butcher, and a drunkard. I am aware of only one thing. General Grant is a fighter. Did you know that before Grant took command of the Eastern forces, we did not sleep at night in Washington? We began to fear the rebels would take the capital. Once in command of that, we feared that foreign countries might acknowledge the Confederacy. But since Grant has assumed command on the Potomac, I have made up my mind that whatever's to be done, Grant will do it. And what he doesn't do, I don't believe is to be done. And now we can sleep at night in Washington. Incompetent? He's winning the war. Something we've been trying to do for a while. We had a feller back home in Illinois who was running for sheriff of his county. They said he was incompetent too. A ne'er-do-well who never did anything in his life. Why, he can't even make a decent political speech, they said. But on election day, he stood up there in front of the crowd and he said, "Feller citizens, I ain't never made a speech before, and I ain't gonna make one now, except to say I can whoop any man in the crowd." He was elected. And that's the way I feel about General Grant. He can whoop any man in the crowd. Drunkard. If I ever find out what kind of whiskey he drinks, I'll send each of my generals a barrel of it. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet, if God wills that it continue until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in right, as God gives us to see right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves, and with all nations. I better not make that mistake again. I'd come into the White House one day in quite a big hurry and had carelessly laid my hat on the chair just like that. That afternoon we had some visitors, one of which was a lady of quite wide proportions. She was what you'd call broad in the shoulders. And I guess she must have been flustered and excited at being in the White House and seeing the president and all. And she didn't look to see where she sat, and she sat right on my hat. This angered me no end, but I didn't want to say anything or embarrass her in any way, so I just remained silent. But the longer she sat there nesting on my hat, the madder I got. And when she got up to go, I couldn't help myself. I went over and I got my hat, my poor hat, and I said, "Madam,
I could have told you that it wouldn't have fit you before you tried it on. Do any of you believe in the significance of dreams? 2 nights ago, I retired late. I was weary and I fell into a deep sleep. I soon began to dream, and there seemed to be a death-like stillness all about me. Then I heard subdued sobs as if a number of people were weeping. I thought I left my bed and went downstairs. There I heard the same weeping and sobbing, but no one was in sight. I went from room to room. Every object was familiar to me, but where were the people who were grieving as if their hearts would break? I was quite scared, but I was determined to find the cause of it. So I kept on until at last I arrived at the East Room. Before me was a catafalque, and on it lay a body wrapped in funeral vestments. Around it were stationed soldiers acting as guards, and there was a throng of people gazing on the corpse, weeping and moaning. I asked one of the soldiers, "Who's dead in the White House?" "The president," he said. "He was killed by an assassin." Well, then a loud burst of grief woke me up from my dream. Well, when this war is over, and that won't be very long, I tell my son Tad that we can go back home to Springfield, Illinois. That's where I was happiest when I was a young'un, sitting around the stove telling stories and cracking jokes, riding the old Eighth Circuit, practicing law. I tell Tad I'm going to buy him a mule and a cart and a pony, and he can make a garden in a field all of his own if he wants. One of these days, by golly, I hope it's soon, I'm going to be taking that long train ride back to Springfield, Illinois. Taking that long train ride back. I'd like to go back there and sink out of view and be forgot. Although I suppose I will be remembered for some of the marks I've made toward civil liberty. But I'd much rather have it said of me that I plucked a thistle and planted a flower where I thought a flower would grow.